State University. And we're going to be talking about the hidden injustices of adoption. Thanks so much. Let's give Dr. Merrit a warm welcome.
Make the video of me just my chest. That way I can click through this. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of run through basically the first 75% of this really quickly because the last bit is the philosophy part, I guess. There's just a lot of like facts and stats and research that I want to cover quickly, and so I'm happy to talk about some of that in more detail in the Q&A. I just don't want to take up too much time. I have like 30 minutes.
Sure.
Okay. So this is kind of like a project that I've been working on for several years. It's really like a pastiche of several projects. So some of them are already out in the world published, some are going to be soon, and then some are like not yet. And I'm working on a book right now that kind of ties this all together. So that's, if it seems like it's a little all over the place, that's part of why. I just find that when I give talks like this, people have not even thought about any of this. So I never really know what my audience is going to be like. So I'm happy to linger on whatever. But basically, obviously, as the talk title suggests, I'm talking about adoption, and I wanted to make sure from the outset that I define what I mean by adoption, because obviously it has a lot of different connotations, and people don't always understand what's the most typical form of adoption in this country. I'm going to be sort of sticking within the United States. I actually don't know a ton about adoption practices in many other countries except for Australia, strangely enough, because I have a colleague over there. But in the United States, the type of adoption that almost often we're talking about when we discuss adoption is plenary adoption, which might be a new term for you. And that's just the kind of like legal transactional adoption that, you know, one set of parents relinquishes rights and another set of parents takes over rights, and there's a permanent, irrevocable kind of, you know, severance there. And it often, almost always involves exchange of money and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very like systemic kind of thing. Now, I'm not talking about like step-parent adoptions or kinship adoptions that are often very informal and don't involve all that legal stuff. That's not what I'm attacking, because when I start attacking adoption, people start freaking out about that. Like I'm saying, never ever take care of kids. That's not what I'm saying. So I'm talking about plenary adoption, and I'm looking at a lot of the, like, these are some of the pervasive myths that surround what adoption is. If you hear just how it's discussed in the news and movies and all sorts of other places, it's like win-win for everyone involved, and it provides a better life for children, and those children are ultimately lucky and grateful, or they ought to be, and the people who engage in adoption are charitable and selfless, namely the adults, the adopters and the birth parents. And then this other myth about babies being blank slates. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that one, but I have a lot to say about it, so I can have a lot of thoughts on that one. So that's what I'm going to kind of run through for the first chunk of this. But what I really want to get to, and this is maybe more the subject of the paper that I have coming out in Feminist Philosophy Quarterly, and part of the book that I'm working on, is to talk about the marginalization and subjugation that adopted people face when they try to talk about any of the negative impacts that adoptions had on their life. So I am tying this to feminist projects that deal with epistemic injustices, especially hermeneutic marginalization. I'll talk about what that is if you're not familiar. All sorts of other things that happen to us. And I say us because I should probably note that this also has a very personal element to it, because I'm an adopted person. So I think I provide this insider perspective that is, you know, more and more welcomed, and especially in feminist philosophy, but even in just general academia now, the kind of what some anthropologists call the emic perspective, being somebody who is affected by the systems that I'm talking about. And I have this term that I've coined called adoptism, and I'll get to that at the end, to talk about the kind of overriding social narrative that silences people like me. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. So the first myth I thought we could think about here, and you've probably heard some of these in popular culture, that like I said, the better life narrative. So the myth to explode here is that the better life of adoption is provided by the parents who adopt those kids. And what I think is we can look at studies that suggest that might not be true. This also overshadows that adoption itself is just the process of taking ownership of a child from the parents who, are genetically responsible for the child. There's not a lot of discussion of relinquishment, which is the act of being given away by the first parents. And all of that is traumatic. It's actually not a good thing for the baby or the child. And even like childwelfare.gov, if you go to the site, it says this, right? So they recognize that this is a problem. But still, like the better life is supposed to make up for all that trauma. But I also think that we need to look at the systemic underpinnings of this, right? Like this is kind of rooted in this classist sense that the better life really means more money, because that's typically what happens if the adopted person enters into a family that has more money. It's also a really colonialist ideology of kind of like, we know best for you, you'll be better, even if we uproot you and like change your life. And especially this is going to be true in transracial and international adoption. And then also white supremacy when we talk about transracial adoption as well. So, like I said, I'm going to speed through this because otherwise I'll talk for way too long. But the idea of better life, like if we examine some of these correlational studies, and I say they're correlational because like they're not suggesting that adoption causes this, but I have a paper out in a journal where I talk about it's probably not adoption itself, but the relinquishment that we need to examine, especially infant adoption, that adoptees are more likely to be under the care of a mental health professional throughout their life. They're more likely to attempt suicide. There's some studies that suggest it's as much as 4 times likely than non-adopted persons, and eating disorders and all that kind of stuff. So there's also psychosocial problems like substance abuse and antisocial personality traits and rejection sensitivity and all of that. And then physiologically, now this is interesting to me because I haven't found a lot of research suggesting this is the case for domestic adoptees, but for international adoptees especially, immune problems and dermatologic conditions and things like this. And you can easily sort of surmise why that would be, right? If you're adopting a child from Ethiopia and bringing them to the States, like their bodies are not equipped for this particular climate or this particular food culture and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of overlooked issues with adoption that people haven't really considered. Now, of course, I always get this rejoinder when I bring this stuff up. It's like, well, that's not necessarily adoption that's causing that. It could be something else. But I think there's enough of this research out there, pages and pages of it that I have collected, that we should be thinking about it and kind of, turning our heads a little like, what's this all about? So then in terms of other issues that adopted people face that are often overlooked, the myth that kind of is underlying this stuff that I'm about to talk about is that biology is just really irrelevant. And this particular myth I actually blame more on the kind of progressive leftist side of things, because if you know anything about the sort of postmodern critique of bioessentialism, which I think is really useful and good in a lot of ways, it also goes too far when it comes to kind of thinking of family as entirely arbitrarily chosen. And like biology is completely irrelevant. So, I can talk about my story a little bit here, which I'll do throughout the talk. Just being adopted for me was, in a closed adoption, which is not as common anymore, but that means that all of my records were kept for me and I had no contact with my biological family and they couldn't contact me. And it was like very much hush hush until I turned 18, and then I could request to try to find them. Which is already just weird, right? To think that like you're not supposed to know who gave birth to you. And so I kind of grew up with this idea that it was scary that my adoptive mom or that my biological mom might come looking for me one day. Like I was scared of that as a kid, I remember. But when I did want to find out who my family was, I was told by my adoption agency that I could pay them $1,000 to help look for my family, which I was like, this is what, so but one of the first things that happened in my awakening, I guess you could say, is that was one of the first moments. I grew up kind of believing all these myths that I'm about to talk about. Like, I just was like wholesale, drank the Kool-Aid. I like loved being adopted, and I knew who my real parents were and all that kind of stuff. They were my adopted parents. So this was like a moment of like, what? Why do I have to pay you? I thought that you already made a lot of money off of me, you know? So I didn't. I ended up doing one of those commercial DNA kits, and that is also problematic that I had to pay to do that, a lot less than $1,000, but still. And then you're in this database forever. These commercial DNA kits are not entirely 100% good, right? So especially if you're a person of color, apparently I've been reading a lot of stuff about how they're used to profile by the cops. So anyways, I did that and I was able to find my family, which is great. But, you know, I think about my adopted friends who are international adoptees from like India, for example, where that country just disallows all commercial DNA testing, maybe for good reason. But they can't, there's no way that they can find their family just through a DNA kit. It's just useless. So, I mean, there's just so much stuff that adoptees have to navigate that we don't think about and don't talk about. Not to mention the loss of your culture and your language if you are an international adoptee. So, and then finally, there's this like, you know, what aboutism that often happens when I bring this stuff up. Well, there are plenty of adoptees that I know that are happy to be adopted, and I'm like, yeah, I used to be one of them. I get it, and you know, I never would sort of say to an adopted person like, you shouldn't be happy. I'm not going to, you know, tell somebody how to feel about their adoption. But there's a little bit of interesting research here about the abandonment fears that a lot of adopted people have that never really go away, and that might actually be playing into why they don't bring up the negative aspects to their adoption with their parents, and they avoid topics. Stoke and Morgan has research on this, especially with transracial adoptees who experience a lot of microaggressions. If you know Colin Kaepernick's story, recently he's been in the news for raising this issue about his own adoptive family and how they were good to him, but they were also racist. You know, he's like, they're white people. I don't know. They were kind of, they had these microaggressive things they would say to me. And he never brought it up until recently. And not surprisingly, he got called an ungrateful piece of shit as soon as he did. So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of this stuff that I think even for the happy adoptees, there might be some fear and obligation and guilt, which a lot of us just call the fog that you're in for however long until something kind of drags you out of it to see maybe the truth. If you know, like Plato's Cave, I wrote about this at one point where I was thinking about my own journey out of the cave, so to speak, kind of like thinking everything was as it is, and then you realize there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. That's kind of what the fog is like. So that just is a little bit about some of the negative aspects of adoption that are often just completely overlooked or unknown, I think, to people who are not adopted. The other myth I wanted to talk about is that adoption is, you know, an act of saviorism. You know, it's rescuing children from abuse and neglect, which this one's the harder one to crack, because in a lot of cases it is the case that children are in abusive or neglectful situations, and we should care about that, obviously. But we also have to consider that simply adopting kids, you know, placing them in adoptive homes doesn't guarantee they won't also be abused and neglected by their adoptive parents. The Hart family is maybe the most prominent case, where if you don't know about this, these two women, a lesbian couple, adopted 6 Black children. 3 of them were siblings and the other 3 were siblings, and then ended up driving them off of a cliff in Oregon after drugging everybody on Benadryl. And, you know, like, this is like a big deal story where you're like, well, that's just like a weird thing that happens. It doesn't happen that often, but you can just kind of start digging and see that. I was actually looking for this person, Piper Lewis, the other day to find out more about her story because I wanted to put it in the slides, and I couldn't remember her name, and I like Googled something, and another thing came up about, you know, a Ugandan adoptee that was tortured and abused by their parents, and Piper Lewis was trafficked by her adoptive mom, and she ended up killing one of her rapists when she was 15, and now she's still like being tried for that. So it's not that uncommon. So that's one thing to just consider, that we don't necessarily absolve the problems of abuse and neglect by adoption. And a lot of times adoptive parents turn out to be pretty exploitive of their children. If you just go on social media and like look at adoptive parent accounts. They really love to like parade around their adopted kids and talk about basically how wonderful they are for adopting, or how challenging it is to have the special needs adoptee that they have, and they make money off of this often. I think Mia Farrow and Woody Allen are the poster children of this kind of thing. They have, I don't even know how many kids they adopted. There's a documentary about it. And several of those kids died by suicide. So, you know, this exploitation comes in the form of movies and books and all sorts of things. Like The Blind Side was just discussed recently because Michael Oher finally got himself free from his conservatorship with his parents. The Canadians don't even like hold back by just calling it what it is. They have a show called How to Buy a Baby. So yeah. And if you're thinking, well, it's not buying kids to adopt them, I mean, it is. It literally costs money to adopt, and you might wonder where that money goes. It does not go to the birth parents, that's for sure. This is actually a pretty moderately priced table here, but you notice what happens when you get down to the full African-American program. It's cheaper to adopt. So yeah, I think the national average right now for private adoptions is something like $50,000 for an infant. It's cheaper, obviously, through foster care. So another thing to consider is that the myth of a forever home being provided is not always the case. Rehoming absolutely happens. Mika Stouffer's maybe the most high-profile case of this. She's like a YouTuber, and she's always talking about all of her kids and her wonderful Instagram perfect life. And she got this little kid from South Korea who's no longer in this picture, obviously, and rehomed him because he was autistic. She couldn't handle it. She made a big sad sob story post about it. There's a Facebook page called Second Chance Adoptions where it's like literally marketplace for trading children. It's disgusting. And I and a lot of other adopted people have tried to get this thing taken down so many times, but it never happens. You can't have stuff like this about pets on Facebook, by the way. You can't treat pets this way, but children, totally cool. Yeah. So finally, then, like I said, with all this stuff about child welfare, one might wonder, couldn't we just like maybe make sure adopted parents are checked in on more, because it seems like a lot of them are treating their children pretty poorly. But it just doesn't work that way. It's like you have to go through the process of being approved to adopt. And once you are, it's just sort of assumed that you're going to be fine after that. And like this fails to account for the fact that adoptive parents get divorced, fall into financial hardship, start doing drugs, whatever can happen to people. So they're just not checked up on. And one of the reasons for this, I think that I am not the only one that thinks this, Dorothy Roberts documents a lot of this, it's just the racial disparities in adoptive homes. So like 70% of adoptive parents in this country are white. And if you look at how like child protection services works, they investigate Black families a lot, but not white families so much. You know, white families are investigated, but then they're far less likely to have their children taken from them. And there's just a lot of racism within the child welfare system that Roberts has documented. So you start putting all those pieces together and you realize, well, the reason kids are not being checked up on in adoptive homes is because they're in primarily white and wealthy adoptive homes. Yeah, and just actually the other day I was teaching some of this stuff in my class and talking about how there's an app, or was supposed to be an app, for finding birth parents online, so you could like adopt that way to kind of skirt some of the costs of private infant adoption. And now they're doing a tool. Apparently, I just found this out the other day, that matchmaking tool sort of based on dating websites for finding children, based on algorithms, which if you know anything about like some of the algorithms used in child welfare, they're also notoriously bad at profiling, racial profiling. So this is all disaster in my mind. This is no good. And just kind of shows the commodification of children in this system, right? It's really not so much about welfare, it's more about procuring children for wealthy white parents that want them. And so speaking of money, the idea of poverty being something that children are rescued from in adoption is also problematic. Mostly because when you look at child welfare, like poverty is often just conflated with neglect. Like neglect just means poverty in most of these settings. And I think it's something like 80% of child welfare cases where children are removed is because of quote unquote neglect, but it's mostly poverty. So when you start to think about that, you know, it's like, why do these children cost $60,000-$70,000 to adopt? Where's that money going? And the answer is pretty simple. It's just to the industry, to the adoption agencies, the people that work in the higher echelons of these industries. But I think more importantly, if we think about the birth parents themselves, and I think about my own birth parents in this case, they were really young. They were 18, didn't have a lot of money, just totally weren't equipped and ready to parent. And I know my grandmother wanted to keep me. I found that out recently. But that's discouraged by the adoption agencies that are in there, like talking to my mom, right? Like trying to get her to give me up because they're going to make money off of me. And they don't make money if my grandmother adopts me. That's just a grandmother adoption, right? So I think about that in terms of like, well, if my parents paid, I think I was pretty cheap because it was way a long time ago when, you know, I'm old. But but if they paid like $15,000 for me, that money could have easily been used by my parents to like establish themselves, get a house, you know, find time to look for jobs or whatever. But that's just not how the industry has operated. And books like Ann Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away, where she talks about all the coercive practices of the adoption agencies, are really kind of eye-opening if you want something to make you angry. This is in the pre-Roe v. Wade days, and now we're in the post-Roe v. Wade days, apparently. But pre-Roe v. Wade, there's this phenomenon called the baby scoop era, where just so many babies were given up for adoption because it was so, you know, frowned upon to be an unwed mother. And a lot of these girls who went away, they were basically sent away to maternity homes, homes for unwed mothers, and basically forced to give their babies up for adoption. And so once Roe v. Wade was passed, a lot of the rates of adoption plummeted, but there's also the kind of like destigmatization of single motherhood. And there's a lot of things that coincided with this, but a lot of people think that we just don't have these practices in place anymore. But if you go to like one of these pregnancy resource centers, we have one in Jonesboro called Options or something, but it's not what it sounds like at all. It's like you go there and it's do not have an abortion, give your kid up for adoption. Very, very much the same coercive practices still persist. I mean, there are still homes. They're not called homes for unwed mothers. They're called maternity homes, I think, where you can go and like basically you'll get free healthcare and all this free stuff if you just stay there and promise to give your kid up for adoption. It's just like it's still happening. So Gretchen Sisson is a sociologist that works specifically on birth mothers. She uses birth mother as a term because all of the women that she talks to are, as far as I know, identify as cisgender women that are birth mothers. So she specifically looks at their experiences giving birth to and then relinquishing children, and they just overwhelmingly regret it. They have like mental health issues like adopted people, and they like one of the things that comes out of all her interviews is that money was the biggest impediment to them keeping their kid. They just felt helpless. There was nothing they could do. But if they had just somebody had handed them like $1,500, they could have like gotten all the stuff they needed, you know, had some time for postpartum recovery and then found a job and gotten on their feet, especially these single mothers, right? And so when you couple that with everything I just talked about with the money and how much it costs to adopt, it's like you have these adoptive parents fundraising literally on GoFundMe for kids. Like this person raised $83,000 somehow, which is more than they needed, but I don't know what they're going to do with that money. It's like you could give that money to these struggling parents, right? And then of course, you know, considering that children are, like I said, discounted depending on if they're not basically white, able-bodied infants, the picture starts to emerge where this is more about, you know, trafficking children than it is about saving them. And again, I'll mention Dorothy Roberts because she really ties all this together to the child welfare industry. Her book is not about adoption per se, but to me, it's all connected. And she's been arguing for 30 years now for the kind of complete abolition and reformation of the child welfare system. And finally, regarding money, just because this really hits the nail on the head for me when you think about Roe v. Wade, since we're talking about it, it's like Roe v. Wade obviously just got, you know, struck down in the Dobbs decision, and a lot of adopted people were talking about this when it happened and before it happened. But Amy Coney Barrett, who's one of the justices who was like really behind this, she was talking about these safe haven baby box laws and how, like, you know, you can put a baby in a box at a fire station and it's all good, it's fine, you don't need to have an abortion. She has 2 adopted kids, by the way, from Haiti. And in this, in the Dobbs decision, I think it was Alito who was actually referencing this footnote from the CDC, talking about how, well, ever since Roe was passed, we just don't have any babies available for adoption. And they literally refer to us as the domestic supply of infants has gone down. So this is why we need to get rid of Roe v. Wade. So that was kind of infuriating to read that or hear that. So anyways, now that I've gotten you all hopefully angry about this, you know, what's funny is I bring all this up and there's still like this like resistance, like, okay, well, but it's like, what about, you know, what there's some kids who are like really in need of homes, and I absolutely agree. And we can talk about all that. That's totally a, you know, valid discussion to have. I have lots of answers to all those what about questions, but the problem is, like, whenever an adopted person tries to talk about any of this, it seems there's this basically epistemic injustice that occurs, some form of it, dismissiveness, gaslighting. We get pathologized. One of my favorites is like, you know, you seem really angry, you should maybe get therapy, which I always respond with like, yeah, you're probably right, and let me show you all the results of like what happens to adopted people. We're kind of messed up and we should have therapy, right? Do you want to pay for that? Because that's another thing that is not just guaranteed of adopted persons, that they will have free mental health care for life, which I think should be the very minimum. I have a friend who I'm publishing a chapter with right now. He's in Australia, like I mentioned, and he told me that in Australia they've passed a law that adoptees have to have mental health care, free mental health care. So they're at least doing something right-ish. But yeah, so there's all the stuff that happens when adoptees bring up any of this. And there's even a card that has been made by, I don't even know which adopted person made this. Nobody really knows. It's been around for so long. Just trying to get this out of the way so you can see some of these. But so these are just some of the responses that many of us are used to getting. My favorite up in the top corner there, would you rather have been aborted? Because like in the context of Roe v. Wade, right, it's like that, first of all, the two have nothing to do with each other. And I've written about this several times, that adoption is not a solution to pregnancy. It's an alternative to parenting. But yeah, when you look at all the studies too about how much adoptees suffer, a lot of adopted people, when you ask them that question, they'll just flat out say yes. I think that's really shocking, and we should pay attention to that. But yeah, you get the idea. These are all the kind of dismissive remarks that people will give us. And I think that all of this constitutes a sort of specific form of marginalization of adopted people. Now, not the happy adoptees, because the ones that are towing the party line of I'm glad I was adopted and I am grateful, they are put on pedestals and used by the adoption industry as evidence of how wonderful adoption is. But people like myself who are going to talk about this stuff truthfully, we are often subjected to these epistemic injustices. So some specifics in regards to this. Christy Dotson has a term that I find really useful here, testimonial smothering, which is similar to the idea of topic avoidance, I think, that I mentioned earlier. But, you know, if I'm talking to somebody and they've already said some pretty perniciously ignorant stuff about adoption, I might just already kind of shut down and be like, I can't talk to this person. I know they're not going to hear me, basically. They're just going to keep whatabouting me. So I might smother my own testimony or truncate it or just kind of like give up, you know, trying to talk about something. So this is one form of, which it's a form of epistemic injustice. And I was going to say, if you haven't read any of the literature on this, Miranda Fricker defines this as being harmed in your capacity as a knower. And it can take on many different forms, like where you silence yourself or you're actively silent. Somebody will tell you, if you keep talking about this, I'm going to fire you or whatever. That's an obvious overt case, but it happens in more subtle, insidious ways, I think, and this is one of them. She also talks about hermeneutical marginalization, and this also very much ties in with adoption to me, because you just don't see a lot of literature authored by adopted people generally when it comes to adoption. You do see, you know, the happy adoptee narratives a lot if you do see adoptee authored literature, but sort of the idea that we under contribute to the knowledge pool on this subject, and that's just really ironic considering that the most knowledgeable people about adoption would be the persons that are adopted, right? We know what it's like to be adopted and we're not ever consulted on it. And then another form of epistemic injustice that we face is throttling, that Calder talks about this being denied access to knowledge that would otherwise like strengthen your testimony or make you, you know, more likely to be in that community of knowers and make sense of your own experiences. And I mean, there's obvious ways that adoptees are subjected to this. He also says that this is based on identity biases. And, you know, this is a hard thing to defend. Like, are adoptees biased based on being adopted? And I would say probably no, if you look at the just general societal narrative. People love adoptees. Like, you know, like we're kind of like poster children for like being saved and rescued, and it's wonderful. But I think if you really get under all that, like I've been doing here, you see that that's really infantilizing us and treating us as perpetual children. And it's not that we're actually valued, and we are sort of, we have identity biases placed on us, which make it harder for us to be taken seriously. And so one of the biggest ways that this manifests that I've argued, and Ryan and I have argued in our chapter coming out, is there's this sort of gratitude imperative imposed on us, or I call it the injunction to gratitude, where if you're not grateful for being adopted, something's wrong with you. That's just it, and you're dismissed. And that's why all this dismissiveness and all this epistemic injustice happens, right? And like I said, I've coined this term adoptism to kind of characterize that form of marginalization that we experience. And I borrowed this from a sociologist who's been working on suicidality for several years, and this is his most recent book, where he talks about the injunction to live and to futurity. We were talking earlier about Sarah Ahmed, and she has a similar idea about happiness. If you don't want to be happy, something's wrong with you. If you don't want to be alive, something's wrong with you. And this is a really pervasive idea of suicidality, right? Because like, I mean, a lot of us want to help people who are suicidal, and we think, okay, you need some medicine or therapy or something, right? But then there's also the kind of social critique that says, like, it's really rational to not want to be alive in a world where, like, you're a trans person. This is Alexandra trans, and like, it's like, why wouldn't I want to die like the way I'm treated, and like the marginalization that I face? Like, that actually makes perfect sense. And so why do I get treated like I'm an irrational, crazy person? Even criminalized, right? People call the cops on you, people call CPS on you. So I look at that, and that's like a model for me to think about adoption. And so I call it adoptism, where it's like, you don't love adoption, you're pathologized, infantilized, you know, maybe not criminalized, but there are adoptees who have had death threats against them for speaking out about stuff. So it's pretty serious. So in short, because I know I'm kind of like running out of time here, like where I'm heading with all this, and this is maybe the most contentious part, is that there's no reforming adoption to make it more ethical the way it works. Like, it's just, there's too much epistemic injustice, actual psychological damage to adoptees, just too much, right? So, and it's tied in with the foster care system, which is tied in with child welfare, which is tied in with the prison system. There's a foster to prison pipeline that's well established. Dorothy Roberts, again, I'm just gonna like, I always say, just read her. She's smarter than I am. She knows what she's talking about. But like she is calling for the abolition of the child welfare system, which I think necessarily involves adoption, which means then essentially that we have to build something better. We have to care for children without buying them. We have to care for children without erasing their identities and making it impossible for them to know who they are. And we're not going to like really see this and embrace this idea without first becoming virtuous listeners, which is what I've been talking about, sort of actually valuing adopted people and what they have to say, even if it's uncomfortable. You know, it's the truth of their truth, and we have to listen. So this also means then decentering adoptive parent voices. This has been the most difficult thing for me. I can just talk briefly about this, trying to publish on this stuff, because it turns out that there's a lot of adoptive parent academics in the world. Think about various reasons why that might be. Actually, a lot of adoptive parents that I've talked to in academia, they feel like it was the more virtuous thing to do, that procreating would have been bad for the environment, or, you know, all these other kind of like leftist ideals, which I agree with in some sense, but I'm like, also, do you hear yourself? You're like, I was at a talk at the APA recently and heard somebody say that it would be an act of political resistance to have a donor conceived child and not tell them that they're donor conceived. I was like, wait, what? I don't get it. So if you'd imagine that some of the most prestigious authors in philosophy are adopted parents, like Sally Haslinger, for example, it becomes really difficult to break through that barrier and say, okay, but you need to stop talking about adoption and let me talk. You know, just that is really difficult. Even for somebody who's so known for her social justice writing and her racial justice and all of this, it's like, okay, but no, you have adopted 2 Black children. You maybe need to sit down for a minute. So yeah, I mean, that's what I'm up against, and I think that's what a lot of adopted people are up against. But yeah, I think it's difficult and still needs to be done. I'm open to any questions or discussions.
We'll pause here, sharing.
Pause and sharing. Okay, like,
okay. Or just stop sharing, maybe.
Share the one for that.
Or no.
Wait, how about I resume share? No.
I wonder if I can.
Any questions? Yeah, Olivia.
In the beginning, one of the things you talked about that you want to go with children as
What did you say? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Like adoption and having children. You didn't really go into much about it.
Oh yeah. So that myth that, you know, especially if you adopt really young babies like infants, there's this kind of, it's similar to, I think, adopting puppies. Like, you know, like if, and I've fallen prey to this too, because I always think, like, because I used to volunteer at the Humane Society. It's like, man, some of the dogs that you get in there that are older, they're like messed up, right? And if you could just get a puppy, then you could not have to deal with all of the trauma that the older dog might have had. That is definitely a kind of ideology in adoption. And so you have adoption agencies that'll like let you go in to the birthing room with the birth parents and be there to like catch the baby and all this stuff, so you can like almost be, don't even sit in the bed. Like, it's weird. So I guess the idea is that if they're young enough, they won't know. And I have a paper where I discuss, this gets really kind of skeptical, but I discuss like how important the bonding is between a gestational parent and their infant. Even in utero, of course, you know, like babies know the sound of their mother's voice and smells, and they prefer the breast milk of their mother as opposed to others. And there's all these studies that indicate we come out like knowing stuff, actually. So to say that we're blank slates is just, I mean, the blank slate mythology is just wrong in all sorts of other areas. So I don't know. I think that there's a traumatic memory that is stored in the body of an infant when the only person they've ever known to trust and love, their parent, is suddenly absent.
Yeah.
And I think that might be what we can use to explain some of the things that we see manifest in adopted people's lives later on.
Why do you think that myth was kind of built like so in this for like adoptive parents? Like, I'm curious to how this idea of like state slate came about. Like, I think that's very interesting and kind of absurd.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I mean, it's like it has a long history. Obviously, yeah. People talking about this, like John Locke, that's the person I think of in the history of philosophy. But I also feel like most people just know that's not true. You know? And yet, when it comes to adoption, we kind of like forget that. And yeah, I'm not really sure. I think it's just people want to really believe that they're, yeah. think a lot of people recognize that there's traumatic elements to being adopted or being put in foster care, being removed from your family. Like, you know, there's tons of books written by people about the separation of children from their parents, like at the border of Mexico and the US. And it's like, we see it, that's traumatic, it's bad, you don't do that. But if it's a baby, they're not gonna know, like, they're not gonna remember. And I think it's some of that thinking too, magical thinking that, you know, if we just get them young enough, it won't matter.
Trying to convince yourself you're doing something good.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. And I think people probably don't actually think babies are entirely blank slates, because they're, like I said, there's this recognition within even adoption agencies where you'll look at the major agencies and they're like, yes, well, adoption is going to be traumatic for your child. So they do recognize that even an infant is probably going to have some kind of residual trauma from the separation. But it's like, somehow it's better the younger you get them, you know. So this is where I draw on my other area of interest and research is on animal cognition, and I look at like studies of other mammals, rats, dogs. Like, you know, there's like so much stuff about how like separating them at birth is just really, really bad. Like rats will get addicted to cocaine really easily if they're taken from their mothers at birth. I don't know why people decided to test this on rats. It sounds really, really mean, but I mean, you can easily get a rat to be addicted to cocaine more than you can when they're not separated. So then I think about the stuff that, you know, I mentioned about adoptees having addiction problems. Like, okay, well, isn't there a correlation there? Like, so, yeah.
Well,
it was less of it was more like like, what do you think the first steps would be? Because like the first steps in like changing the common perception of adoption, because in my life my parents used to consider, like, they were considering adopting another child, and I begged for another sibling. And then even until I came to this presentation, this is why I was so interested in it, I've had this idea of like fostering when I'm older, just because I felt like it would be a helpful thing to do. And so I thought, I'm now questioning that mentality, and I was wondering if you had any like other like further resources to read.
I mean, I would definitely read Dorothy Roberts. I like haven't seen her praises enough. She's got, if you just look her up online, she's got plenty of articles. You don't have to read the entire book, because she's more invested in talking about foster care, and for her, especially as a Black woman who studies this stuff from a legal perspective too. You know, she just gets really into it. But you know, one thing I bring up with foster care to people, if people just don't understand this, I think is that the whole point of fostering is supposedly family reunification. Like, the child welfare system exists so that fostering is supposed to be a way to kind of like give parents the time they need to get their shit together, right? Whatever it is, like maybe they need to go to an addiction counseling program, or maybe they need, you know, to get a job. But the whole idea is that eventually the kids are going back to them. It just doesn't happen that way, especially in Black communities. So like I was saying earlier, the likelihood of a child that's taken from, especially a single Black mother, of them ever coming back is just exceedingly low. Yeah, so when people use the term like, I'm going to foster to adopt, I just cringe. Like, that should not ever be the goal of fostering. Fostering should be to get them back to their parents. So like, I think fostering is good in that sense if you do it for that reason. But most people, when I hear them, they talk about fostering as the low cost adoption option, and that's not it, you know.
Sometimes people talk about like, you know, a child so much like their parent, and they mean like a sort of, you know, kind of like genetically, or because they're related, they're so much like their parent. And so in the context of this like blank slate myth, there's probably both of those ways of thinking. But how do like adoptees sort of experience that dialogue, like that like idea of searching for like a continuity between traits or capacities or the way you live in the world, and like being connected to your birth parents, right? Like, with that narrative in the world, is there like also a kind of I don't participate in that, or people don't say that about me anymore, right?
Oh yeah, you mean like with in relation to adoptive parents?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is so much more marked in transracial or international adoptees. Like my friend Ryan that I'm doing this chapter with, he's in Australia, but he's a Korean adoptee adopted by white Australians. And he has some really good, you actually like phenomenological discussions of being adopted, or he talks about like looking in the mirror and like being surprised at his not whiteness. You know, he's raised in whiteness and he feels white so many times, but then he looks and he's like, I'm obviously not. And yeah, it's just obvious that you're not related to your adoptive parents. For me, it was like, I mean, if you look at my adoptive mom, we look really similar. And that was probably on purpose. There was a lot of that, especially when I was adopted, of still trying to match people, because here's the fun thing is like transracial adoption wasn't allowed for a while.
Yeah.
And it was like frowned upon because you wanted to like make it seem like nobody knew that you couldn't have your own babies and blah, blah, blah. So I know that my adoptive mom and my biological mom are similar looking, which means I look like both of them. So people would often say, you look so much like your mom. And my mom would just, you know, get really happy. And I remember just kind of feeling like, but I don't, or, you know, I shouldn't. It's like, I wasn't as impressed by that comment.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then I think, you know, didn't even get into the discussion of reunion because that's a whole other, I don't know, can of worms, I guess, that brings up and dredges up a lot of these feelings, I think, of relatedness and trying to like find your place. Because on the one hand, look, you know, the blank slate myth is nonsense, but then we can't discount how much nurture does play a role in who we are. But then when you meet your biological family and you see things and experience this uncanniness almost, like this is the person I am and this is why, and I see it now. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not articulating this well because it's kind of stuff I've only been in a reunion with my family for a little while now, so I haven't really processed all that enough to be academic about it, I think.
This is kind of a personal testimony, I guess, but my dad was adopted. But he was born in England and he was adopted as an infant. But what's weird to me is that for some reason his adopted parents didn't like get him a citizenship. So now he's 55, living as with a green card, because like he was born or like not born, but raised in California, but his adoptive parents didn't take that like initiative, I guess. So I don't know, it's a little weird to think about.
Yeah, I've not heard that happening with English adoptees. I don't hear of English adoptees very much. Irish, yes, because Ireland has this like long history of the Catholic Church and you know all that. So it's been in the news lately. They've been like apologizing to all the forced adoptions that they caused. But yeah, with international adoptees, I hear this a lot about citizenship. It's not guaranteed, so there's a lot of international adoptees I know that don't have citizenship, or it's tenuous, or there's some kind of questionable thing going on there. So yeah, it's one of those things where I think intersectionality is super important within the adoptee community too, because I don't have to navigate all this stuff being a domestic white same race adoptee. Like I could have been one of those people that was never told I was adopted my whole life and maybe never figured it out. Which is not the whole ethical conundrum. You should not do that. I'm just saying it could have happened to me. I know some late discovery adoptees and they have a whole other layer of trauma. But I could have been, and I think of my friends who are fighting for citizenship right now. It's like a whole thing I don't have to think about. So even within our community, we have different intersecting layers. But yeah, it's really interesting.
We talked a lot about private adoptions that where you don't have contact.
The closed adoption.
The closed, that's what I meant. But I know a few people who have grown up with their adoptive parents, but also continuously had contact with their biological parents. And I just wanted to know if you kind of come across any research where that may have a better impact. I don't know if that's the right word, or like if adoption like had is that like a better route?
Yeah, so like the type of adoption that I said I was gonna limit myself to is plenary adoption, which means like the type where there's a legal transfer of parental rights permanently. And so even in open adoptions where there's some kind of communication maintained between the parents, the birth parents and the adoptive parents, it's still almost always plenary. So it's like plenary just means there's like this, you know, severing of ties permanently. But in open adoptions, you at least have that, you know, connection to your biological family. And I haven't seen any definitive studies that I know of that say that's better or worse. I have actually seen some suggestions that it can have its own complications because then there's sort of like fighting that happens and you know all that kind of stuff. But there's also just the practical issues of in the states at least there's not any legal protection for that. Often what happens is there's like you know an agreement signed between the birth parents and the parents like we're gonna maintain contact of this level or you're gonna write me letters or you know keep me updated, but it's not legally enforceable. And so what happens often is after a few years the adoptive parents are just kind of like nah, we're done with this, and there's nothing to be done about it. So that's one of the that's not really an effect on the adoptee per se, although it probably has effects on the adoptee, but it's more of a just practical problem with open adoption. So yeah, I actually have a student right now in my feminist philosophy class who's adopted, and she was adopted from foster care, and so she was raised with her sister, which is at least good in that sense. She has a biological family member that she was raised with, but they knew their mom off and on, but there was a lot of this like controlling by her adoptive parents. She's told me like you can't talk to her this much, you can't have Facebook because you can't let her find you, and she's druggy and like you know this. It's almost worse in some sense when you think about it. Like you're hearing about what your adoptive parents think about your parents all the time. Whereas my parents just they didn't know anything really about me. They never met her. They was like she was just really young and like couldn't take care of you and she loved you so much she gave you away, and that's all I ever heard. So I didn't form any negative thoughts about her or really positive ones. Whereas my student I think was raised to like hate her mom basically, even though she was right there and could talk to her, and I don't know. That can be really problematic.
Yeah.
I feel like really we just need to redefine like what a family is and who is allowed to like raise a child, because like kind of those instances where it's like you've got adopted parents raising you while you're also in communication with your like birth parents, and it's like why not just make it like a community raising is kind of what I think about.
Yeah, no, and that's what not to keep talking about Dorothy Roberts, but what she mentions this like the sort of racist underpinnings of adoption itself, when she does talk a little bit about this, that the disruption of families and Black families traces back to slavery, and the kind of like the kinship networks that they would have were disrupted because it would keep them from organizing and talking to each other too much and like disrupting the system. And that still happens today in the foster care system, she says. And so it's like, but Black families notoriously do this extended kinship care, and like that's frowned upon. I think there's tie-ins here with like also capitalism and anti-communist sensibilities. So it's like we don't want to have this communal care kind of thing. We want nuclear families and you know 2 parents and all of that kind of stuff. But I think if we adopted more of that model, then like yeah, we'd have villages caring for children. And really what I always say is we need to be caring for families. Like you should adopt, if we're going to adopt, using that term loosely, we should be adopting the birth parents too, because they're the ones that are vulnerable and need to just be empowered. I think about so much Gretchen's work on this. Birth moms just even $1,000, you know, and instead of spending $60,000 to adopt their baby, like what if we just all cared for the family? And yeah.
I also think motivational services would be really helpful. Obviously, you talked about how adoption agencies will kind of gaslight and manipulate that adoption's better for kids. Motivational services are also really interesting. The other thing we brought up was the kind of, but they're proposing and this room, but there's one right down the street called Black Choices, and I would love everyone to be aware that there is a clinic posing as helpful, and it is not. It's really fascinating.
Interesting. Yeah, the one in Jonesboro is called Choices on Main, I think.
And
similar.
It's crazy. They look like an institution that's not at all.
Yeah, and I'm sure as soon as you walk in the door, it's like, like yeah. Yeah. I have something else I was going to add to you. I have so many things I could talk about. That's why this is only 30 minutes of like a book that I'm trying to write, but yeah, I lost my train of thought, so I think I'll think of it.
Can you say a little bit more about, like, you mentioned Catholic institutions? What is the relationship between, like, I know there's Catholic Charities, which is like structures adoption, but are there lots of religious organizations that are involved? And like, what's the balance of like nonprofit, religious, for-profit, like, what does it kind of make up of adoption agencies?
I don't know exactly an answer to this, but I know a large percentage of adoptive families in this country are like evangelical Christians. And there's like, Glad Me is a big one that's definitely got religious underpinnings. Bethany Christian Services is another one. But yeah, I mean, there's some private adoption agencies that I don't think are affiliated with American Adoptions, might not be. But I look at more at like the kind of, so Catherine Joyce has a really good book on this called The Child Catchers, and she documents all the evangelical push to adopt that goes on, and so she has like, that would be a good book to look up some of those stats. It's been a while since I've read it, but looking especially at international adoptions and how like Christian missionaries or whatever will go over to these countries, and especially after something bad happens, like in Haiti and right now in Palestine, there's already people, the vultures are circling. They're like, we can adopt some Palestinian babies, and so the agencies will go in and try to kind of con the babies away from these parents. But then you have the language barrier where they don't understand what they're doing and they're being exploited for that. But it's all under the guise of Christian missionary work. And so a lot of these international wings of these Christian adoption agencies have been shuttered because of all the scandals that have been uncovered recently, which is a good thing, I think. Yeah. But it's still happening here domestically too. Go ahead.
I've already spoken.
So I am an adoptive mom of two brown children. And so I'm curious as to what I can provide to my kiddos to have a safe space and being able to process all of the things, because there's all of the things rattling around in their head. So what are things that would have helped you? Because I know you said that growing up it was everything's good and fine, but looking back, were there things that could have been helpful for as you got older to process it a little differently?
Yeah, it's hard to say because I was thinking about your question about open adoptions. I used to always think like, why didn't my parents do that? What the hell? Like, but then I don't know if that would have been a good idea. I'm not really sure, but I always preface my story, which I didn't do today, but I try to preface my story by saying like, I had a really good life, and I love my adoptive parents. I'm not grateful to them, but I love them. I'm grateful that they provided me a great life, but like, they did everything right, and I still think adoption sucks. And I think that's why my testimony is pretty powerful, because it's like you usually get that response like, sorry you had a bad life, but not everybody does. Like, you just had a bad experience. I'm like, no, I had a good experience. And I'm still very close to my adoptive parents. And I think because they did these things that you're trying to think about, like they were really always open to talk to me about any of it, and help me search, and are supportive. They like know my biological uncle just went and stayed with them in their mountain house. Like, so they're really cool. It's great to have that support, because a lot of adoptive parents get really sketched out by their kids meeting their biological families. I don't know what your situation is, if the kids even know who their parents are or have any contact.
They have two very different situations.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've been telling, I have a friend who's got a sister who's got adopted kids, and they're both of them are having mental health struggles right now. They're teenagers. She's like, what the hell do I tell her? I don't know what to do.
Oh, we started there, but therapy started when they were like 3 and 4 years old.
Yeah. No, and that's good too. That's something my parents didn't. I think my parents didn't have knowledge of just how traumatic adoption can be because I'm a lot older. So I had mental health struggles and I had like, reactive behaviors and things like that. And they would put me in therapy, like, stop being bad, like that was one thing they did wrong, I think, is like if something was wrong with me instead of something's wrong with being adopted. But they didn't really know better. So I do kind of give them grace there. But also I would say like finding a community is super important for adopted people because I didn't know any other adopted people until I was in my late 30s. Like suddenly that's like all I have now are friends that are adopted. Those are my people. And I actually think that's one of the epistemic injustices I didn't really get into is like precluding community. Is something that happens to us kind of on purpose, I think, by the industry. They don't want all of us getting together and talking. And that's that suicidal stuff that I was talking about with Alexandra's work. He talks about it similarly with people that are diagnosed as insane by the mental health care industry. Like, if you get committed to a hospital, like there's this thing that happens where you're not supposed to be friends with anybody there, and you definitely don't share contact info. When you get out, you shouldn't stay connected. But like both Alexandra and I are like, that's dumb. Like these are the people that understand what you've been through. These are people you should be talking to. So similar to adoption, I think is very much something. If you can find a community for them, I think kids these days are much more socially organized. So like my student, I have this student and she's probably 18, 19, and she's already like, adoption sucks, and I'm just like, wow, when I was 18, I was like, I'm gonna adopt one day. So I think kids are like, figuring this stuff out more because of social media, probably.
Cool. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks everybody for coming. We have a talk next week. Yes, on fake news. Yeah, so please come next week.
I have to run. There was